says, oh, no, I just want to say hello. Okay, bye. You can message me if I'm...
All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's now 7 p.m., so we're gonna slowly start the panel discussion tonight. Please be seated, or whatever. Well, this evening we're gonna have a very interesting panel discussion, and we're joined by a number of experts to my right on the regional impact of Myanmar's diverging economies, both licit and illicit, of course. Myanmar has emerged as a keynote in various illicit economic activities in Southeast Asia and East Asia and the wider region, in fact, driven by the surging growth in demand and operations of transnational crime organization as well as domestic operators. The scale of the illicit profit is vast and continues to grow, and particularly since the February 1st coup, we just want to hear from our experts how much has changed and what's the trajectory going forward. We are, of course, joined by three very well-known experts in the field, of course. First, Gwen Robinson, editor-at-large of Asia Nikkei, and also the former president of the FCCT. She'll be here speaking about the licit economy of Myanmar. And next, of course, is Jeremy Douglas, the United Nations Organization on Drugs and Crime Regional Representative for Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And joining us from online, we have Kun Richard Horsey, the independent analyst and Myanmar advisor to the International Crisis Group. Welcome, Kun Richard. Well, I think we're going to start off straight away with Gwen, if you don't mind. Since we're going to be looking at the illicit economy, might as well start with the licit one. What is the state of play at the moment? How much has changed since the February 1st coup? And, as we're rolling towards the end of the year, starting next year, what's the trajectory as well? Gwen.
Well, thanks, Panu, and good evening, everybody in the club and also watching online. As you've put it so well, it's clear that we are seeing both boom and bust in Myanmar right now. There is a booming illicit economy, which you're going to hear a lot more about later, and there are growing perceptions of a collapsing licit or domestic open economy. But really, I think to assess the depth, the breadth and impact of the illicit economy, we really need to look closely at the trends inside the licit or open economy in Myanmar. So that's where I'm coming from tonight. And excuse me if I get a bit boring. We've got some brief figures which are going to run through on slides. What I'm saying might not necessarily match the slides, but they're all relevant data, as up-to-date as we can get. So I think, really, to start, I think the coup leader himself, Min Aung Hlaing, the self-appointed head of the junta or State Administration Council, said it all himself about the state of the economy with a recent speech to mark the 9-month anniversary of his takeover of state duties, as they're called. In a long speech recently, he reiterated calls for increased self-reliance from the people of Myanmar and urged people to use less fuel by increasing the use of public transport and even walking rather than using precious fuel. He also exhorted people to consume less edible oil, both in order to reduce imports, and he urged them to switch to consume less rice. That's basically to follow a more diversified and nutritious diet. But we actually know what's under all this, which is a creeping paranoia on the part of the junta that the economy is crumbling around them, and they seem powerless to stop the rot. He acknowledged that the country was facing various criticisms and restrictions and concluded that, as the saying goes, we must worship ourselves. In other words, he said, to have faith in self-reliance and self-sufficiency for national development. I think apart from these utterances, and the state media is increasingly full of these ideas, some of them are quite crazy, to save money, reduce reliance on imports. We've seen the imports banned and very draconian efforts by the central bank to control currency flows and conserve foreign reserves. But I think there are other signs of economic distress and depleting foreign currency reserves. For example, it's a series of sell-offs of seized illegal timber exports being auctioned off, attempts, as we've seen in the past, to sell off jade, but which have been stymied utterly because the main buyers are Chinese coming in across the border from China, which has not been possible in the COVID situation, and also many other efforts to obviously conserve or curb the bleeding of foreign currency. Myanmar is entirely reliant on imports of refined fuel products, 80% of which have been coming from Singapore over the last 5 years. It's also a net importer of edible oil, sugar, and wheat or wheat flour. However, it has managed to achieve self-sufficiency and even become a net exporter of some products like milled rice, some other crops and seafood. But all this has suffered terribly, not just because of the coup. So let's not forget, I think there's a perception that the coup and the violence, the shocking violence we've seen, has really sunk the economy. But I'm sure most people saw how badly Myanmar was hit by COVID this year, but actually that followed extensive and harsh lockdowns last year also for COVID. So in fact, I think there's a big element as well of an economic hit that was happening anyway. So the coup and obviously the violence have made it far worse. So let's just turn to forecast, Kuntam. From headline figures, it's easy to think the economy is collapsing, and that seems to be the narrative. The key indicators since February the 1st have all been bad, and some key indicators which have been drawn together in excellent reports by the World Bank, UNDP, ADB and others suggest an economic contraction of more than 18% at least this year, with Fitch Solutions reiterating its earlier forecast of minus 20% for the year, while the ADB's latest forecast is for an 18.4% contraction this year. This is, as I said, off an extremely low pre-coup base. I mean, the economy was beginning to collapse well before the coup due to these very harsh lockdowns in 2020, which closed down businesses and choked the economy with near zero growth for that year. The resurgence of COVID after the coup further hit the economy, as has the strong resistance to the junta's security forces, which I'll touch on a bit later. So while COVID infection rates are now, well, officially under 7%, that has a lot to do with extremely limited testing, and we know that state hospitals are overstretched, as are government-linked facilities for testing and also vaccinations, which are extremely limited. So little more than 10% of the population is fully vaccinated as of late October, with about 22% having had a single shot, while proper vaccine programs are still under negotiation. And it should be said, a key sticking point for over the whole vaccine program in Myanmar is the junta's refusal to allow international agencies to freely vaccinate. And there's a lot of concern, particularly after a couple of people were picked up and arrested who were on security lists while they were trying to get COVID vaccines. We've also seen a lot of other key indicators such as trade, including import and export, plunge, Kuntam, and inflation rise, unemployment at new and dire levels, and more chillingly, I think you've all seen the terrible predictions of poverty and hunger, at least double, with an estimated 50% of the population below the poverty line by 2022. That is a staggering amount of people, and also a staggering amount of people that are estimated to be in line to suffer food shortages. So for 2021 to 22, most key forecasters have already downgraded their projections to zero from earlier 2 to 3% growth, and increasingly worse. Fitch Solutions just very recently revised their forecast from 2.8% next year to -4%. So that says a lot about how the last few months have gone, reflecting its view of further problems and the resulting contraction. The IMF, by the way, has projected flat or 0% growth next year, and we're still waiting for the World Bank estimates. Some of the reasons for this are beyond sort of insane violence and the collapse of many systems is rapidly depleting savings of the population, limited cash access, lack of work, even in the informal economy, which accounts for about 2/3 of jobs in Myanmar, much higher costs of inputs for agriculture, and possibly decline in agricultural output. And the surging inflation around the country is partly due to worsening shortages of all sorts of supplies, bound to further drag on private consumption, while the poor economic outlook and escalating conflicts in various parts of the country, and we've all seen some of the terrible pictures, are bound to deter long-term investment. So the SAC's point of view, what do they predict? No doubt hugely overly optimistic and pegged to forecasts of vaccination rates and new economic stimulus packages. They have forecast 3.8% growth in the financial year ahead, based on partly unrealistic assumption that 50% of the country will be vaccinated for COVID-19 by the end of this year. That's in like 6 weeks, and with a 10% fully vaccinated rate, I think I'd be safe to say that's impossible. And of course, the junta has now promised its much vaunted new Myanmar Economic Recovery Plan, or MERP, M-E-R-P, which has to be said, largely based on the ousted NLD-led government's MERRP plan, sorry about all those acronyms, which they've conveniently stripped out some of the major reforms that would have tackled state-owned enterprises and other old dinosaurs. But basically, the junta is promising business loans, public health investment, and support for vulnerable populations. There's one thing missing from the MERP and any communication about the MERP, which is there's no explanation or evidence of how they would propose to fund such vastly increased spending, including a population that is 50% under the poverty line. There's no indication at all. And this brings us to the question of data and the reliability of it. Myanmar's never been known for accurate data, as some of the economists in this room will verify, and journalists. But oddly, perhaps due to remnants of solid bureaucracy in some departments, particularly related to commerce, economy data and economic data, there are figures on things like trade and some other key areas that seem more reliable than others. And in fact, some of the trade data is pretty close to the UN Comtrade figures. One case to show you how much I think the junta is distorting some claims is the question of Myanmar's foreign reserves. So we know for sure, and World Bank verified it in their reports, but it was on the central bank data, that Myanmar's foreign reserves stood last December at $7.6 billion. But in a recent interview with a newswire, the SAC's Minister for Investment, Ong Nang Oo, claimed that the state had $6.04 billion in foreign reserves as of late October. So that's a figure that every Myanmar-focused economist I have spoken with say is nearly impossible, given what we've seen happen since February. It is absolutely, it just would not be realistic that they could have $6 billion after having $7 billion in December and going through what Myanmar has gone through in recent months. However, that figure, like many other figures, is basically unverifiable. That applies to just about a lot of figures that are coming out of the junta. Inflation, let's talk about that. While officially inflation is just under 7%, a huge increase, that's a huge increase anyway from the 1.5% that was pre-coup. Surveys and research, including by WFP, World Food Programme in August, and many other agencies have shown huge increases in the prices of fuel, at 48% increase from a year earlier, cooking oil 37%, rice 13% compared to pre-coup days. So some of those rises are even since January. Overall, the cost of a basic food basket had increased by 16% by August. That's according to WFP. So these sort of things are likely to have significantly worsened the horrendous situation faced by many poor and food insecure households. So I think the real inflation rate, when you take into account, when you add in things like prices of imported fuel products, etc., averaged out, could easily be as much as double that figure. We also know that farmers, struggling as they are paying hugely more for inputs for their crops, like fertilizer, etc. I think more important are the warnings by international agencies that the slide of the economy will, and in I think the view of many experts, already unwound much of the progress that Myanmar has made since the flurry of democratic reforms began in 2011-12. I think the most striking thing about the unwind is how the junta has reverted to its old playbooks. Like the military mindset has not changed for decades. So even organisationally, we're seeing the revival of structures from the era of military rule. The Ministry of Cooperatives, restructuring the bureaucracy in old ways, xenophobic rhetoric about self-sufficiency, and as I said, absurd bans on a range of imports like soap and toothpaste. But like everything in Myanmar, you can have the glass half full or half empty, depending on how you look at it. And this, I think, is exemplified by the surreal disconnect between what I think are the parallel universes in Myanmar now. So consider a well-heeled local or affluent expat can sit in Yangon in a comfortable condo or mansion, even now, swim in their pool, go by cab to a new restaurant or bar, there's lots of hip new bars open, and shop at City Mart, the best supermarket, although they will pay more for imported goods if you can get them at all. And with the steady reopening of key resort areas and hotels and resumption of flights, they can even escape to an exclusive beach resort such as Napoli for a weekend. Yet not too far away in the city, there is fear and danger in the suburbs and poor areas of the city and towns. Bombs are going off daily, as we know. Prisons are full of reports of torture and harsh treatment, and we're seeing a steady escalation of violent incidents. This is in the cities. Now, juxtapose all that with what we know of an even more dire situation in states and regions such as notably Chin, Sagaing, and Magwe, where security forces are conducting clearance operations, bombing, shooting people, torching whole villages. And we know there are at least 500,000 displaced people, some living in the bush in rural areas. We also know that this entire disconnect is fueling a creeping paralysis of some key aspects of the licit economy and a growing feeling, what it's really fueling, I think, no matter, you know, I can show you figures that show actually, surprisingly, that foreign investment has not fallen off a cliff, in fact. It's down by, Kuntam, have we got foreign investment? I think we've got foreign investment figures there. Anyway, it's fallen, I think, by about 40%. Buoyed up, it has to be said, with a couple of extremely big investments. They are by Chinese firms. Anyway, what really is fueling the rot is that creeping feeling of unease amongst business, both local and foreign, and even amongst Chinese companies, which, it's a very friendly government, China, and ordinary people. That feeling of unease is that anything you invest in is a risk, a big risk. So I'm going to cut myself quite short now and just leap to my just a few things I'd like to say at the end, which is my theory is that if you want to look at the economy, you can look at those sort of figures, you can look at the disconnect. But I think what's important to look at is the whole picture. And I think a lot of analysis is focusing either on security, PDFs, ethnic armed groups, conflict, so military activity, or else you get economists looking at the figures and just looking at macroeconomy, or business looking at, investment regulations, or banking. But actually, it all links up, and I think how it all links up is stems from the coup itself, the junta, and some of its policies. Most of all, I would say, is the steady breakdown of the system in Myanmar, and that includes some very important research that has recently been done by an excellent analyst, Matthew Arnold, on local government and how local governance across the country's 330 townships, 17,000 administrators, is breaking down. There is no semblance of proper government in a lot of these areas, and that's at local level. This is beyond really the control of Naypyidaw. So we're not just talking things like garbage collection, but there's things like electricity, a lot of punishment being meted out of people who don't pay bills, taxes not being collected, but also local administrators resigning literally by the droves. So we've got reports of, you can see any day that there's resignations. Sometimes they resign in the 10s or 20s, but there's many hundreds of local administrators who have resigned, and that is partly due to the pushback from People's Defence Forces and that kind of activity that is coming from the populace. And we all know that it's not an exaggeration to say that it seems the majority of the country is extremely anti the military regime, and a lot of them have taken up arms. We're also seeing an escalating campaign of assassinations and urban terrorism, destruction of infrastructure like telecom towers. So I think on the top level with investment, you've got some very big investors being very uneasy, and even more uneasy because it's not just the hard money aspect of diminishing hopes of profit, but also reputational risk. And we've seen most recently the decision by Adani Ports and SEZ to withdraw from a massive port project in Myanmar due to, well, partly thanks to the research and endless efforts of activist groups who do some excellent research on companies with links to military-linked enterprises. So that follows other companies. The ETC company in Singapore has also been asked for an explanation from the Singapore Stock Exchange for its dealings with Myanmar military conglomerates. And I think this is also spooking investors. So just to leave you with that, there is a glass half full and half full view of the licit economy, but I don't think the overall mood music is very good looking forward. And we can come back into this, but I'll hand over to Panu.
Thanks, Gwen. Just to add, I guess, because this is something that I cover as well. I mean, Myanmar, the military government there is already looking at reopening the land borders of China and Thailand next month. And, in the past few times that I've been up there, of course, the COVID lockdown has and of course the border shutting has some impact on sort of the licit trade. But illicit traders in Chiang Rai, for example, are talking already back in April to me about the need to smuggle in petrol, fuel into Shan State, into Karen State, because the system there is not really working properly. And at the same time, I've been seeing, and more now in this past few months, more adverts for people to go work in bars and casinos in Shan State, in Karen State as well.
Near the border.
Advertise. Women and bar girls and all or whatnot to go, and so it seems that the economic activities continue in spite of
Right.
COVID. So with that, I mean, I wanted to go next to Jeremy to talk about the sort of broader picture, I guess, of the illicit economy. I mean, my observation is something that I observed personally, but what is the overall view?
Sure. Thanks, Panu, and thanks, Gwen, for the start. Really, I think. Sorry, there, guys. The first and foremost, I think I'd begin by telling you that the illicit economy can't quite be measured the same way that Gwen described the licit economy. You know, there's no reporting by the entities that we track on their activities. So we have to look at proxies, a lot of different types of data that flow into us from different sources, including neighboring countries, which give us a picture, and from that we try to describe the illicit economy and try to describe the impact of it. So I think that's really important to say at the very, very beginning. And so the so-called formal or illicit economy, there's an interplay with the illicit in Myanmar, and as all of us know, for many, many decades, there's been a very large, outsized illicit economy in Myanmar. And it has changed significantly over recent years. We've had an expansion of elements of it that was very, very profound, starting back 6, 7, 8 years, particularly in the drug economy as it shifted to a new form of drug. But then at the same time, we've seen how resilient that economy can be. It has, on the back of economic decline, and Gwen touched on the fact that even during COVID, the formal economy was flatlining, it was declining. The illicit economy continued to expand through last year. And some of you might have seen the data that we announced in that regard. So that's more or less the kind of backdrop of what we're looking at. But there's more than just drugs. You know, the country has several types of illicit economy that are very active. They, of course, have different scales. I touch on just a few tonight. First is people, migrants. The next would be timber, and then drugs, of course, and within drugs there's more than one type. And I think Gwen very nicely set the stage for people by describing the situation that farmers are going through, and that the kind of people at the lower end of the economy are going through at the moment, because they're the ones that are being hit hardest by the problems with the chat, by the decline of the economy. They're the first ones that were let go. And we can see economic displacement within Myanmar starting to push people to the periphery within the country. As she mentioned, 500,000 people are believed to be displaced, but we see some of that movement starting to come towards Thailand. And last week I was at the border with Myanmar in Songkhlaburi, 3 pagodas, where we had economic migrants, as the government here referred to them, trying to come across in several large groups in Kanchanaburi. And the reason for that is their push out of the country they're trying to get across. And of course, there's an illicit economy that goes along with that. They're paying people to try to cross the border. It didn't work out, so they'll be pushed back. But this economy is starting to roll. It's not really, and I think Panu can elaborate on a little bit more, there's not been huge numbers of people moving, but as that economy breaks down, the formal economy, we expect that this displacement of people will result in more and more migrants trying to make their way, highly likely, putting themselves in vulnerable positions with smugglers and traffickers. Data in that situation is extremely poor. It's not very, very well developed at all, relative to, say, drugs, for example. The other one is timber, and particularly teak wood. And in this case, we're starting to see indications of increased smuggling of teak out of the country. Gwen touched on the fact that there's been these auctions that have taken place of the so-called seized stocks of teak from last year. But it's hard to tell what is going through those auctions, how licit or illicit it may or may not be. But at the same time, we track indicators from this country, Laos, and in Northeast India, which are indicating already that large shipments of teak are moving. And you can see some of that in social media or in government reports about increased seizures of Burmese teak, particularly in Northeast India, which is interesting. So there's a movement towards that market there, which is very, very large and outsized. But I think the more interesting story, and the one that we are all thinking about when it comes to the illicit economy, is in relationship to drugs, illicit drugs. And that's one place where we do have some proxy indicators, some of which are from within the country, most of which are from the SAC or their institutions, but some also from some others, which indicate a lot of activity in North Shan. But also Laos, Thailand, and Malaysia have all been giving us recent reports which are all connected back into the drug situation within Myanmar. And it is a huge economy already, pre the political breakdown and the coup, even after COVID, it was continuing to expand. And only in 2019, we had quantified the regional methamphetamine economy, if you will, at roughly $60 billion. That's the whole chain, of course. But that 60 billion largely is associated with Myanmar, largely associated with Shan State. And if it continues to expand, you can imagine the power of that economy continues to expand. Now, it works in an interesting way, which I'll get to in a moment, about how the money flows. It doesn't necessarily flow necessarily into that country, but it is the point of production for the drugs which impact this region. But something to consider as we look at the drug economy. Synthetic drugs, methamphetamine, do not employ people. So they're not going to take up the slack that the licit economy, as it breaks down, is showing. So you're not going to find people rushing in to make methamphetamine. They can't, because it's controlled by organized crime groups. That's different than it is with heroin, because people can go back to opium farming, and they can go back because it's very poverty related. They can go back to make a livelihood. So if what Gwen is saying plays out in the farm economy, the legitimate farm economy, that won't be playing out in the opium economy, because there are certain prices people will pay for opium to transform it into heroin. So, and we're already starting to see some kind of interplay with an expansion of heroin trafficking within this region. But I think one thing to consider as we look at the meth again is the concentration of money that comes from that, and the attractiveness of that concentration of money. What I'm getting at is that because methamphetamine can be made by small tight-knit groups, largely based in North Shan State, that export the drug, it concentrates the money in that small tight-knit group. So it doesn't disperse out to a larger population as the heroin or the opium might, to some extent, because of course heroin traffickers make all the money, not the farmers. But nonetheless, it does concentrate it. The other unique feature is the concentration of that money outside the country. It's very much a regional economy. The production takes place there, but the deals take place outside the country, the big deals, including for the groups involved within that country. They have bank accounts outside the country. They move their money outside the country. It's safer, okay? And at the same time, they have that's where the market is. So they're pushing it out there and connecting to the buyers and outside the country. So we see a clear expansion, and I'll touch on some data points in just a moment. But we see a clear expansion of the methamphetamine flows at the moment in this country, in Laos and in Malaysia. So I'll just touch on some data points for you. Thailand this year, compared to last year, as of October, was already up about 20% in terms of the seizures of methamphetamine, and that was a record year. So if you're looking back at records, they keep getting set. This year is up close to 20% on last year. Laos is up 620%. So Laos has never seized an awful lot of methamphetamine, but it's essentially, the northern part of the Mekong River is essentially becoming part of Shan State's drug economy at this point in time. And what's at the northern part of the Mekong corridor is Laos, is Bokeo, is places like that. Right now, they're flooded with methamphetamine. So if you look at it, up 620%, okay? So it's still less than Thailand, but that's a massive jump in a very short period of time, in 9 months, 10 months, okay? If you look back, put it in a historical context, it would be up several thousand% from a few years ago. So it started jumping a couple of years ago, but this year it really took off. And I think some of you were aware of recent reports that were some of the major media put out, Reuters, BBC, and others, on this massive seizure in Bokeo. And I think it really Bokeo being the province in Laos adjacent to Shan. They really illustrate the point I'm making about this connection between northern Laos and Myanmar and that geographic spillover. Basically, the drug was being tableted in Laos, but shipped in from the neighboring country. The people producing it are from the neighboring country. They're now just using Laos as though it's also part of Myanmar. So essentially, the spillover is no longer simply of the product itself, but it's also of expansion of the criminality, and essentially the production points are pushing out. So it's also, they don't see the difference between the two places. It's just a convenient place to do business. So Malaysia this year is up 40% for meth tablets. And I think one of the, and Myanmar's down actually. But again, this comes back to the point of the data reliability and the shadow economy. We're getting a lot less reports out of the country than we did last year, for obvious reasons. They went quiet for several months. After the coup, there was a kind of drop-off of reporting. But at the same time, we see some reports coming out of ethnic armed groups. There was one reported last weekend, which was a record, if it's actually to be believed, which was from Kokang, where they seized a record amount of heroin, a record amount of methamphetamine. But that's not the government reporting it, or the SAC, but that's actually a group reporting a very large seizure. One of the interesting stories that's coming out of the region this year, though, is heroin. Thailand's heroin seizures are up 66%. Laos seizures are basically flat, but Malaysia's seizures are up about 90% in heroin. Again, they all trace back to basically the same points of production in North Shan State. So it's that spillover that's really cascading. We expect similar reports out of Indonesia, the Philippines, and so forth over the course of the rest of the year. So just those data points give you a sense of the size and scale. And given that last year was a record for methamphetamine, and then this year again, and again, this is against the backdrop of the conditions on the ground. And these conditions are essentially perfect for those folks that do this business to grow that illicit economy as the licit declines. So I think a couple of quick points of summary. You know, the illicit economy is diverse, but there are different components of it with different capacities. The synthetic drug economy has proven its ability to expand very fast. So it really, really ramped up. We expect, looking forward, highly likely an increase in the opium and heroin economy. After many years of decline, which coincidentally took place with the opening of the country and the legitimate economic growth of the country, people left opium farming and tended to go to other livelihoods, sometimes encouraged by ourselves and by others, offering them opportunities. But the point is that they're now losing those opportunities. They're going back potentially into the illicit. So as we see crop cycles advance, which we'll start seeing in the coming months and seasons, we expect an outflow of opium and heroin. And coincidentally, last year, COVID was the year that it kind of bottomed out. The dropping trend stopped, which again comes back to Gwen's point about COVID had already hammered the economy. So we had started to see that play out a little bit, and this year we're now hearing reports out of Shan, out of our office in Tonji, that people are returning to those villages, they're returning to the opium-producing areas where they can make that livelihood. And then there's potentially a regional and interregional dimension to this, because what happens there is not isolated to there. Australia, New Zealand, Japan are interconnected with the production in Shan State. They don't receive drugs from other parts of Asia, they receive them from there. So at some point in time, as the transport connections start expanding, more flights start leaving from Suvarnabhumi, you're going to start seeing more connection made to those markets, and you're going to start seeing the push of this supply further and further from the point of production. So that's going to be a concern. And I think that means there's going to be some regional solutions, because the power of that economy isn't bound by its borders. Whether it's the situation I described in Laos, where you had this spillover and now physical spillover of actual production potentially. But the point is that you're going to see the power of that economy grow as the illicit economy declines just naturally, because there's more and more attraction to it, because it was already powerful. Even if it stayed the same, it would just essentially grow more powerful. But as it grows, it'll become even greater, that power. And of course, it will become so in this country as well, in Laos, around the region, because it'll draw people to it. So I think we have to really consider, how do we address this at the national level and at the regional level? So I'll leave it at that, Panu. And
sure. Before I talk to you, Richard, we have some online viewers. Just want to ask Jeremy a direct question from what you just said. You know, this guy's called Amzola. He's used the word, is Myanmar a narco state? And, you know, how much does the drug trade, you know, in Myanmar compare to other neighboring countries? And where are the drugs going to India and China? You were talking about Laos and the spillover effect to the rest of the Asia Pacific. I think the gentlemen just want to know the kind of the context of this. Is it a narco state, or is it just a transnational crime thing based in Northern Shan?
Good question. I don't know if you can classify it as such, but definitely parts of the country, it is the dominant economy. So, for example, Shan State is the epicenter of the synthetic and heroin economies for this region. So that state within the country is definitely, arguably, a narco state. And if you look at the actors involved there, the different groups, they're all benefiting from it in one way or another. Either direct involvement, taxation, fees and so forth. So there's a lot of money being spread around in that state, and so you can argue that. I think, but again, I would come to the point I just made at the very beginning. As that economy simply becomes more powerful as the other economy naturally declines or takes the hit that it's taking, it naturally becomes much more powerful. And therefore the conclusion that this gentleman has drawn in his question becomes much more probable. We may be looking at that being the label we might use in future for this state. And I think you can say that about other countries in the world where you might see something similar. Colombia has been talked about in the past, Afghanistan. You can argue about the different countries and the definitions, and they don't like being compared. But the point is that, you know, this situation is getting worse and worse. And I would say that the neighbors of this state are getting more and more concerned, and they rightfully should be.
Thanks, Jeremy. Well, I know that we have two very sort of macro description of licit and illicit. And Kun Richard, I think we're going to rely on you to contextualize it all with all the various stakeholders. When we come to talk about Myanmar, there's so many stakeholders, borders and otherwise. So Richard, can you contextualize for us in the context of the politics, national as well as all the ethnic groups?
Well, thanks very much, Manu. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak tonight, and hello, everyone. I'll try and do that. I'll try and draw some of these threads from Gwen and Jeremy's excellent presentations together and say something about what the underlying drivers of this divergence in licit and illicit economies are, and some of the underlying political economy dynamics, and what that means for the future going forward as well. You know, the drug industry is a very particular one. It's particular in its size, it's huge, but it's also particular because the state itself doesn't profit that much, most likely, from the drug economy. What are the reasons for that? Well, the first is that much of the value chain of the drug economy is outside of Myanmar. You know, the value chain gets greater and greater the closer you are to the end consumer market, and most of that chain is outside of Myanmar. And a big chunk there for profits of drug trade are made outside of Myanmar as well. Now, of course, a small percentage of a very, very large number is still quite a large number, but we have to look also where the money that is made in Myanmar is going, and by and large, it's going to corrupt actors. It's going to individuals perhaps linked to the regime and linked to those in power, but it's not going to state coffers. There's no direct flow of drug profits into the Myanmar exchequer. So you know, that's a certain specific kind of economy. But what we are seeing more broadly, and Jeremy touched on some of this, is a shift, and not only in the size of Myanmar's economy as the formal economy shrinks, but also a shift in the structure. And Gwen talked a lot about going back to the old playbook, the general's old playbook. And one of the ways the Myanmar economy is reverting to a 20-year-old, 30-year-old Myanmar economy is the prominence of natural resources in the economy. It has a growing share of the economy as other parts of the economy shrink or collapse. And, you know, we just have to look at what some of those are. Jade and gemstones. It's going to become very important, I think. There's been a great deal of armed conflict, even in recent days and weeks, in Pakant, in the jade mines, as the Kachin Independence Organization and the Myanmar military jockey for control of those the mines, but also the revenue flows and the transportation routes in and out of Pakant. We've seen, as Jeremy said, with timber, a series of sales of timber by the regime. We don't really know which of those are illicitly extracted, which of those are seized from illicit actors, and which of them are just being illicitly extracted for the purpose of being sold. And then the third area I would point to is metals and minerals, including rare earths. There have been also a series of tenders by the military regime since the coup of metals in an attempt to raise some quick foreign exchange. And there are reports, and again, always difficult to pin stuff down, but there are persistent reports of a surge in rare earth production from Myanmar, production of the rare earth ores and concentrates that are shipped across the border for refining in China. And that's generally coming from non-state armed group areas, but not exclusively. And so why is that happening? Well, you know, at the end of the day, you know, as Gwen described, the regime is getting very, its foreign exchange reserves, it's getting very worried about the economy. It needs funds. And where is the easiest place for the regime to turn when it needs funds? I think the answer is not going to be manufacturing. It's not going to be FDI, despite what Gwen described, that the FDI has not fallen yet off the proverbial cliff. There's been a big hit to the stock FDI, that is people who are already invested leaving, and I think we'll see a delay effect on flow of FDI as well. So it's unlikely that FDI is going to be the regime's answer to where it gets funds from. It's trying valiantly to talk up tourism and opening of the borders, as Panu said, but tourism is not going to be a source of any sort of income in Myanmar for the foreseeable future. And aid flows as well. I mean, aid flows to the government have been suspended. Funding to government ministries been suspended, and so aid flows to the government have also basically stopped. Telecoms, technology, nothing much can be expected there with the internet bans, with the pressure on foreign telecom operators, with the destruction of cell towers. That doesn't look like anything. What does that leave? You know, it really leaves natural resources, and natural resources are a good way for the regime to bolster its finances for a number of reasons. Firstly, because the state owns all natural resources in Myanmar, and therefore it has control, at least in theory, of the profits of that. The markets for Myanmar's resources are outside the country by and large, and so it's a source of foreign exchange. And, you know, the profit levels in natural resource extraction are very high compared to other economic activities, and rent seeking is relatively easy. So it's an easy thing to tax or rent seek. And so for all of those reasons, the regime is leaning quite heavily on natural resources. Of course, we know that oil and gas, the biggest natural resource earner for Myanmar for many years, has become even more important as other sources of income, state income, have declined. And that's the only one where I think one can say that it's a licit business, at least in the extraction, albeit that an illegal regime is benefiting from it. All of the other forms of natural resources we know are extracted or exported, at least in part, illicitly or illegally. So I think that's what's driving this shift to natural resources, and it's going to have serious implications for ordinary people, which I'll come to. I think it's worth noting then that the drivers of the increase in the drug economy and the drivers of the increase in the natural resource extraction are different. The drivers in the drug economy are due to the resilience, as Jeremy said, of that industry. It's shown itself to be extremely resilient, both to COVID-19 and its impact, and to the coup. And the reason for that is that these illicit economic actors design in resilience into their game plans from the outset. They have to be resilient to respond to different law enforcement efforts, closures of borders, difficulty importing precursor chemicals, shifts in end markets. In a sense, it's a complex logistical operation that they have going, and solving that complex logistical operation implies a certain amount of resilience to the kinds of shocks that we've seen. But also, the drug trade thrives on uncertainty, and the coup has created an enormous amount of uncertainty. And so those actors in the illicit drug economy look to the future and find it difficult to see exactly where things are going. what's the security situation going to be like? What's the environment going to be like in 12 months or 24 months? There's a lot of uncertainty around that. And so uncertainty drives a need for cash and a need to make money while it's possible to do so. And I think that's driving quite a lot of this surge. And then when it comes to the regime itself, unlike in the natural resources, it's not that the regime, I think, is leaning on the drug economy, because it's not that the regime, as a government, as a state entity, necessarily gets any money out of it. It's more about a shift in priorities. The regime is not focused on anti-drug activities at all, but more importantly, it's not focused on cracking down or putting pressure on those non-state groups who are involved in it. And that's different from a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, the military's priorities was kind of making sure that none of these groups got too big to take on. The military doesn't want these illicit economic actors getting so powerful that they're impossible to challenge in a way that the WA have become. And so if you look at a group like the Karen border guard forces down on the Thai border, they have been expanding their business operations, illicit business operations, year on year for many years, getting very rich in the process, getting very well armed in the process. And so a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, and at the beginning of COVID, the military's priority was to squeeze this group and prevent it from getting too rich and too powerful. But now the regime has a completely different set of priorities. It has a whole set of enemies, almost the entire country, and it can't afford to take on any more. And so we've seen a complete shift in the military's approach to the Karen BGF, from trying to squeeze and constrain their operations to basically allowing them a free hand to do what they want, as long as they don't fight the military, and as long as they continue to cooperate in its operations against others like the Transnational Union. So, this shift in priorities has meant that illicit actors have much more freedom to do what it is they want to do. I think they said casinos as well, and Panu pointed to some anecdotal evidence of that. These are operating in many of the same border areas, and the Karen BGF, for example, is one of the new actors getting in on that with its Shui Cocoa development. So the prospects don't look good, because all of the factors that are causing this divergence, this collapse of the licit economy and this surge in the various illicit economies, all of those factors look like they're around to stay for some time. This is not a transitory phenomenon. This is the new normal. And that means that this divergence is going to continue and increase. And that's bad news for many different people. It's particularly bad news for the ordinary population of the country. Illicit economies are not redistributive. The profits go to a small few, and they don't benefit ordinary people. They don't create jobs by and large, as Jeremy said. And if they do create jobs, they're not very good jobs. They create jobs like being a jade picker in the jade mines, which is notoriously dangerous and not all that lucrative for many people. So, this shift, this divergence is very bad news. And it enhances the power of abusive and criminal economic actors, which has an impact on the human rights of the population. And we have to include among those abusive, illicit economic actors now the Myanmar military as well. So all of this is rather grim, and the prognosis doesn't look particularly good. I think there's a separate conversation to be had about what can be done about it, and I think there is in Myanmar not very much beyond, not very much at the moment, but there is potentially much more that can be done at a regional level, as Jeremy mentioned. So with that not very uplifting set of comments, I'll end there and turn it back to Panu. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. Just before we go to Q&A, I mean, there's already a lot of questions flowing online, but of course for people here, you can also go to the microphone at the back and ask questions. But before we go to that, I mean, and Richard was ending there about conversation, a regional level conversation, and someone online also mentioned is about whether ASEAN members have or had been or are interested in discussing with Myanmar leader about problems like the illicit economy in northern Shan state. Is there any ASEAN dimension in the past, or is there a regional political will, if you like, to address this kind of issue? Jeremy?
Not that I've seen or heard of at the moment. In one-on-one conversations across the region here, outside the region, the near neighbors just outside, there's a lot of concern with what they're seeing, but there hasn't been any discussion that I'm aware of with at the leadership level in ASEAN. I would hope that there is, because I think it might be a point. First of all, it's something different to talk about. They need points where they can work on that government or whatever they are to push them. And I think this is one, because the spillover is affecting the region incredibly badly. But I've said this before February. I was wondering, at what point do they say that this is a problem? Because it's been record year after record year after, and everyone in the ASEAN meetings tends to smile, nod, and move on. So I often wonder at what point enough is enough when it comes to the issues that we talk about, because we need leadership in this region to take these issues on. It can't simply be the United Nations calling for action, right? Yeah. And the people of the region are the people that are vulnerable to the spillover. The drugs that are flooding the streets of Bangkok come from a certain place. It's not good for Bangkok. It's not good for the people in Thailand. And yet, we struggle to get action that we would think would be helpful. So I think that, but we're not quite there yet.
And the other question, both to Jeremy and Richard, actually, sorry, Gwen. It's about the money. It's about the money from drugs. Whether how much of that you guys are seeing is being used to buy weapons for sort of ethnic armed militias. I mean, we are seeing, the whole narrative of post-coup Myanmar is one of, among many, the increasing conflict with ethnic armed groups and such. How much of the drug money we were talking about? I'm guessing that you have different answers, obviously, but I mean, what's your view on this question about how much money being used from drugs to weapon?
Maybe I'll let Richard take most of that, but I think we know from the history of the country that that's how a lot of these militias or ethnic armed groups have been financed. And I think it was said well by, since the dawn of the opium production era, the big illicit opium production area by the KMT leaders, to fight, you need guns for an army, and the only economy in this part of the country is drugs to buy the guns. So something like that. And I think the situation has not changed over all these decades. It's a little bit morphed and changed, and the actors are a bit diversified, but nonetheless, it's still the way that they finance themselves. And we see little glimmers of arms trafficking. We've seen that from Thailand. There's been accusations of weapons from different sources coming through here. And Northeast India recently, I don't know if anybody saw, but if you track these reports out of Northeast India, they seized right at the Myanmar border in India. I think it was well over 100 IEDs that were being moved into the country. That was a week and a half ago. So there is arms trafficking taking place from different sides of the country in there. So how that's financed, we can guess, but no evidence, direct evidence.
Richard, sir, any response?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two answers, right? There's the answer in the classic kind of insurgency economy of Myanmar, and that's a multi-generational, multi-decade insurgency economy. And there, I mean, illicit income has been key to the established ethnic armed groups. Some of them, those in Shan State, definitely drugs. Others have relied on teak. Whatever needs they have to raise revenue, they have done so, and a lot of that has been natural resources. A lot of that has been illicit. And if you look at the rise of new ethnic armed groups over the last 10 years, at least part of that, I think, is down to changes in the drug economy and the ability to make money from that. But we should be very cautious about extrapolating that long-standing illicit economy of insurgency to the conflict situation that faces the country today, which is a very different situation, where there is quite significant armed conflict in central parts of the country, the northern dry zone, the People's Defense Forces, as we've heard about in previous FCCT panels. And it's my distinct impression that that fighting is not being funded by the drug trade. There hasn't been enough time apart from anything else. These are not areas where the drug trade is particularly prolific. There are other sources of income for these groups. And so I don't think we should be very cautious about extrapolating what's been the political economy of insurgency in the past and extrapolating that to the fighting that we see today.
If I can just add, I completely agree.
Sure.
It's not like the people who are in the drug, there's dominant players in the drug trade, and they're not letting in new players. So they're not about to start, so I think, which is what Richard's more or less getting at. You can't take that situation, which is how certain groups finance themselves, and simply apply it to the new insurgency.
Right. And Jeremy, there's a follow-up question. There's a lot of interest about drugs. Drill and Value Online, he said that could we see anti-criminal or anti-corruption operations in Myanmar if these issues are it's clearly transnational? Can AUKUS country approach ASEAN, or if ASEAN is the outlet to stop these transnational crime issues, could we see that happen? And is China allowing this neighboring state to accumulate wealth through drugs and others? I mean, there's several things that to break down. China, Western countries' action, and ASEAN in terms of anti-drug and anti-corruption operation. Okay. I mean, it's a lot to unload, but I think in a way, it's been an ongoing thing.
Right. I wouldn't equate ASEAN forums with action, but what I would suggest is that at least if the ministers of the region can coalesce around the fact that this maybe isolate the discussion around what we've described, which is the growth of this economy and why and where it's happening, and then they can maybe get some kind of political momentum behind some oomph to their political discussions. Maybe that would be helpful. But again, the tendency there is to agree to principled statements that everyone is going to agree to, all 10, and that's difficult as it is. So you're not going to expect very much out of that. I think on a bilateral basis, they would have much better result, i.e. the government here flies in and talks to them at a very candid level. I think they have to be careful, though. I have conversations with governments around that country, and the challenge for them is that when they approach quote-unquote government to government, they aren't approaching those that actually have control over a lot of the territory where this business is taking place. So there's real limitations to approaching Naypyidaw and asking for action. They don't have the ability. And as Richard touched on, he touched on some very big, significant counter-narcotics operations in the past couple of years. I think you were referring to Kutkai, Richard, where there was an effort made to take down a BGF, a PMF, that was involved, very famous case, and to contain them and strip away their arms and discipline them. But the point being that that was done by the Myanmar military with the police. The Myanmar police themselves could not do such a thing. They aren't in a position to do that because they're just not well equipped enough and they're just not big enough. So, and as Richard had said, there's other priorities currently for the government that are doing those kinds of things. So there's no real capacity to address what we're describing government to government. On the Chinese side, we've talked to them, to their vice minister about this, and they've been concerned for the better half, most of this year about the situation. But you'll notice that, first of all, I don't have Chinese data to report because they just don't give us any until they deem it necessary. But the point is as well, though, that they've fenced their border very effectively. Gwen touched on the fact they closed it for COVID, but they've enhanced that since this year. There's a lot of fencing, a lot of security forces on the border. And of course, that's part of the reason that Laos is up 620%. They've just started pushing more of these drugs into Laos. So China has taken their action on their side of the border. Yeah. And now they're watching what's happening on the other side with great concern, but they're not going to step in on the other side as far as I understand.
There's a person, Jeremy Process asked a similar question. How did China crack down on its territory and its nationals in Myanmar out of the dynamics of the illicit economy? Are we seeing a shift in any way, or is there a major crackdown by the Chinese on their people in Myanmar?
They have announced some big operations to stop economic crime on the other side of the border, shut down online gaming casinos that were targeting China, mainland China, if you will. But there's still effort to be done, frankly. The drug economy is fueled by a two-way trade. All of these massive amounts of drugs that are spilling out across Asia are fueled by the chemical industry, the bulk of which is located there. So I think there's still an awful lot that can be done on that side of the border to address and dampen the illicit drug production within Shan State itself, and that currently is not taking place. Now, for a variety of reasons, the chemical industry is so big and a lot of the chemicals aren't controlled. Internationally, the trade is not a controlled trade for some of them, but nonetheless, that could take place.
And one more question from our long-term members, Peter Jansen. You mentioned opium in your presentation earlier. Will production of opium also rise in Afghanistan, also in the chaos, and is it ripe for more illicit trade? I mean, what's the dynamic? I mean, Afghanistan is also going through changes as well. I mean, opium there and opium here. I mean, are we seeing an increase in both region or?
I can't speak to Afghanistan because I haven't worked there in some time. I used to work in Pakistan, but there is the potential for the situation in Afghanistan, if the Taliban were to clamp down, there is a global heroin market, and there is a spike that could take place. That has happened in the past. If you look at the historical data, when they did effectively ban opium and heroin production in, I think it was before 2001, like late 90s, there was a spike in production in the Golden Triangle. Now, the two heroin markets are generally separate.
Right.
But if there's a shortage outside and in the market where the Afghan heroin flows, then highly likely that it would be met by production from other sources, and one of them would happen to be Myanmar. So it could spike, yes.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah. But just final point on that, I think we have to also consider there's a big heroin using market in this region, and it is the world's biggest population base. So if the heroin production rises, there's plenty of market to soak it up. Lots of potential users and potential users to take it in. So I think we have to be very careful to think that it'll be exported far, but it definitely will impact the countries around it very profoundly.
Fair enough. Thanks, Jeremy. For those of you here at the clubhouse, please feel free to step up to the microphone to ask questions. Please identify yourself and tell us which panelist you're addressing. Please, Oliver.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, good evening. My name's Oliver Slow. I guess this is a question for anyone who wants to take it. I think you all kind of had the capacity. A big drive of the anti-coup movement has been to obviously cut off the regime's access to funds. And we've seen countries, obviously like the UK, US, Canada, kind of put in place targeted sanctions, with Australia being, not doing that. But clearly that's not enough. So is there space for like a global unified response to kind of cut off the junta's funds? And I guess what might that look like, with a review in particular of the role of, say, Singapore and the banks there?
So who do you want to take this? Gwen, maybe, or Richard?
Well, it's one of my favourite topics, but I think we all... let's look at Syria. They've been trying this for the last... Who's still there? Assad. I mean, it's really, really difficult, and we all know the reason that there has not been concerted international action against Myanmar in any really serious way is because two members of the UN Security Council constantly protect and ward off any real decision that would actually have some kind of serious effect, and that's Russia and China. So until I think Russia and China would fall in line, which they're highly unlikely to do, there's no prospect that there'd be an international agreement. But I do think that the recent moves by Singapore, including the Singapore Stock Exchange and the Monetary Authority of Singapore, to respond to research and new evidence of links between companies listed on the Singapore Stock Exchange and Myanmar military-owned conglomerates, was really very encouraging, because Singapore has been one of the keys in the region as the place for banks that are really the main bankers, I think, to a lot of the Myanmar-linked, military-linked companies. So it's not an outrageous idea, but I think until the Security Council supported a global thing, we're not going to see that kind of action. What does Richard? You probably have also. You looked a lot more at the UN dynamics.
No, I'd agree with all that. I mean, I think there's obviously the question of what like-minded countries who are prepared to do something can and should do. But if the objective is to bring down the regime economically, and we have to look at who will be its supporters of last resort, and that is the region and others beyond the region like Russia, and that would be a much harder nut to crack.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Gwen. Any more questions from the floor here?
Doesn't seem that way.
No questions? I guess, I have a question of my own, if you like, you want to indulge. I mean, looking ahead, I mean, Gwen, you highlight this whole sort of the decline, right, of the Myanmar economy. The political situation doesn't look like it's going to be resolving anytime soon. It's going to worsen. I mean, what would be the prospect, the outlook, ahead next year? Are we going to see different dynamics come into play? I mean, would there be more investment? Will China become more assertive? That's a big if question, but of course, what's your view?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'd like to hear the others on this too. But I do think I didn't actually get to some of the points I was going to make about the glass half full scenario, which is that, actually, what we're already seeing is signs of certain kind of, I guess you could call it stabilization or what you might call weary and broken-spirited acceptance. There are workers going back to work in factories. The Tilawa Special Zone, Economic Zone, 5 months ago was only operating at 35% capacity. It's now at nearly 90%. People need to live, survive, feed their families. I think there's a huge civil disobedience movement, but a lot of that is civil servants being supported by or encouraged by the NUG, the National Unity Government, which is managing to push some funds out to support CDM. But basically, I think in the private sector, we're really seeing a slow return of workers back to work. And as I said, some of the early signs of what you might call stabilisation, or at least less bad than before. Next year could be less bad than before, as evidenced by those economic forecast figures I mentioned, even IMF 0%, or even Fitch at -4%. That's a big difference from -18% or -20% this year. So I don't know. There are some veterans in this room that were around in 1988 when, a similar disruption, conflagration happened in Myanmar, and some very bad years. And then we saw what happened, which was eventually, things were either accepted in bad spirit, but people accepted and the country limped along, and then along came a reformer in 2010 or 11, or a quasi-reformer if you like, but a semi-military government that actually opened it up and led to the comeback of the rise of Aung San Suu Kyi, etc. So, I think though that one thing the UN Special Envoy, who's just left the position, Christine Schreneberger, said on her departing week is true, which is this time there's every sign, unlike previous times, that people will not give up. So I think what we're looking at is a kind of prolonged stalemate with some pushback that will continue. There are people who will not give up. They'll fight till they die, whereas last time I think a lot of people did give up, and I'm not including the ethnic armed groups, some of which have been fighting on for 60 years, but I think this time that certain PDFs and others will probably fight to the death, and that would suggest that what we're going to see is stalemate and neither side being able to claim victory. The most important thing, though, is, I think, the anti-junta forces, whether you lump them all in together or separate, but collectively they have denied the junta victory. There is no way the State Administration Council can say they control their country or the economy. So that, anyway, that's my view. I'm sure you might have something to say, Jeremy or Richard.
Hey,
Well,
Richard.
I think Richard is frozen. Oh,
Oh, Richard, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, you're coming in and out a little bit, but did you hear that? I'm sure
Yes,
you have.
yeah. So, I mean, on the one hand, clearly a coup plus COVID is a worse situation than a coup and not so much COVID. So, that's where the figures for next year look slightly rosier. There's still a decline, not a growth, but a less precipitous decline. But I think we have to unpack that a little bit. I mean, part of the emergence recovery from COVID for Myanmar is not just about the domestic situation. It's about the resumption of demand, and particularly demand for Myanmar labor as the rest of the region, particularly Thailand, opens up. So I think that might help. It will help remittances. That might help ordinary people who are facing, economic desperation to cope a little bit GDP implications. But I think on the coup, it's a little bit of a dead cat bounce. Sure, the initial shock of the coup and the intense violence and the CDM movement has hit the economy hard. There's been a readjustment period. Some economic activity is resuming. But if we look at the long-term trends, I think it's very, very dire. I mean, the banking situation is dire. Economic governance is dire. But more than anything else, confidence has just evaporated. Nobody has any confidence in the regime's ability to run and govern the country, much less run the economy. And so I think that means that there's going to be a continued series of shocks, and I'm not sure we'll see a recovery in the future on that front. I think we'll see another leg down potentially.
great. Thanks, Richard. We have a question from the audience. And I have two
hi.
more on the online, but please go ahead.
This is Charlie McCann from The Economist. Is there any evidence to suggest that Tatmadaw is worried about being able to pay the salaries of its soldiers, or indeed that it is unable to pay the salaries of its soldiers?
Yeah, I think, Richard, you've done some research on that.
Richard, can you hear the question? It was about this Tatmadaw ability to pay the salary. We've lost your audio. I think your microphone is off. I can see in the left corner.
Okay, well, maybe until...
Yes, hi.
yeah,
I don't know if you can hear me or if sorry, my internet is a little bit unstable. But look, I think there are two separate questions, right? What kind of economy is everyone in Myanmar going to face? And then what is it that the military is going to be able to glean from that to continue paying troops and the other things that it vitally needs, keep its defense industries going so that it can manufacture the bullets that it needs and so on. To pay soldiers, that's going to be their first priority. I mean, they're going to let a lot of other things slip before they fail to make payroll for the troops. And payroll is in chat, and they control the printing presses. And so I think, no, there aren't any signs that they are not able to pay the troops. And I think that will be one of the last dominoes to fall. I mean, they would print whatever they wanted or needed to avoid that sort of situation. But will we get there? I mean, who knows? I think this comes back to inflation, the cost of goods in the market, whether salaries are keeping up with that. That's a big headache that I think they're going to have.
That said, if I can just add, I think there is some, and we recently had on a panel here the head of one of the military defectors groups who are new tutor of people soldiers. And so there is evidence sometimes, and maybe that's not due to lack of currency, because as Richard said, the junta can print whatever money it wants, And that's, I think, another reason that's driving inflation. But actually, there is evidence that they're not getting pay through to some soldiers that seem to... There was a whole little unit that defected, apparently, and hadn't been paid for weeks or months and didn't have proper rations.
I think that's a logistics and supply chain issue, in the same way that they can't get necessarily food to them. You know, it's dangerous and difficult to drive on these roads, and military convoys are being targeted very regularly. So resupply and so on is a huge challenge, and I think that would be part of it.
And if you're getting the demoralisation, I think that is an issue. The kind of harsh conditions that quite a lot of the units are working under.
All right. Well, I have two last questions from online. So, going to Gwen first. Peter Jensen also have asked a follow-up. Has the Japanese FDI, foreign direct investment, dried up completely? Won't they want to stick around to balance off Chinese dominance for the Myanmar economy in the long term? What's your view?
Well, put it this way. I mean, Japan has been very careful of making any big new investments so far, but actually one of the biggest foreign investments in the country is the joint venture that Japanese beer company Kirin, or beverage company rather, has with Myanmar Economic Holdings, which is a 100% Tatmadaw or military-owned company, and that's worth more than $500 million. And the Japanese company announced shortly after the coup that it would exit the joint venture, therefore implying that the joint venture was over. In fact, you can't exit. I was going to make the point that a lot of businesses in Myanmar that have invested in fixed assets, like factories, cannot exit. I mean, Kirin can't exit. Who's going to pay Kirin like $500 million for factories in Myanmar with a beer that is being boycotted by 80% of the population? I mean, so basically Kirin has a problem. It can't sell, and partly I don't think it wants to, because it is a very lucrative business, and what Kirin would like to do is buy out the Myanmar military. But again, no country like Japan would want to have a company that's going to hand over $500 million or even $250 million to the Myanmar military. So it's actually stuck. And I think Japanese development aid is also on track there. They haven't actually pulled things out. But as far as new investment goes, I've seen no evidence, and I think any Japanese company that did sort of a lucrative deal in there would come under a lot of pressure, because actually there is new pressure growing in Japan, even amongst ordinary, activists, about this involvement with Myanmar. I don't know if
Richard,
you have
anything to add on China-Japan thing and FDI?
I mean, just on Japan, I mean, the huge investments that have been flowing in over the last decade or more, have been private money that's been backed by an implicit or explicit sovereign guarantee. The idea being that there's, a very good relations between Japan and Myanmar, that the Myanmar government would not cause problems for that the Japanese government was supporting it politically in many ways, and there's now a huge question mark over that, right? More than a question mark. It no longer looks feasible, that kind of framing. And so while the big investment that's there, much of it may not be too quick to go to the exit. There's a lot of sunk cost. I think it's very unlikely that large new investments are going to come flowing in at the current time. And I think that applies to China as well, to be honest. I mean, Chinese private capital is also looking at this situation, wondering if this is an opportunity or not, and I think generally concluding that it's a mess that they don't really want to get embroiled in.
Great. And last question is to you, Jeremy. It's a question close to my heart as well. How have the casino and online gambling industries in Burma have been affected by the coup and by China's efforts to recall its citizens in Myanmar and counter money laundering abroad, especially with regards to places like Shui Koko? This is from Mars Jury.
Well, it depends on the location, how the casinos have been affected. We understand that there's actually starting to be some activity back in Shui Koko. You might have heard the same, and I think that that's not surprising. So we'll start to see more of that as the region opened up and travel starts to open up. But other parts of the border, I was at a crossing last week where the casinos have been shut for a year and a half and nobody knows when they'll reopen. There's no indication of activity there. So it's different in different locations. But there definitely has been a very strong move by China to suppress the online gaming that's targeting China. And I think that is not done yet. So they're going to continue to target the characters and the businesses or the entities involved in that targeting of mainland China. I think it's a good point, though, to raise the casino industry. I think we have to look at it in a slightly sub-regional way. You know, I touched during my brief comments at the beginning on Laos. Right on the border of Shan State happens to be a very large casino operation, which many of you are aware of, called King's Romans. And that operation has investment from Myanmar in it, at least within the zone. And I know that there's increasing investment in that zone. And so again, that contiguous nature of the northern Mekong, you can't really separate the two. And I think you have to look at the proliferation of the casinos outside Myanmar as well as being very much connected to what's going on in the country. So we'll see. I think we're going to start seeing the casino industry ramping back up a little bit.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, on that note, I mean, I would like to wrap this up now so that the rest of you here, we're very happy to see a lot of people return to the club. The rest of you can have drinks and chat after our talk. So I would like to very much thank our three panelists of experts. And also I would like to also extend special thanks to UNODC for donating some money to support the club, as well as we also are honored by the presence of Ambassador John Paul of Luxembourg, his wife, and the delegation, the staff of the Luxembourg embassy here, who have also been very kind to our club recently. So I want to give special thanks to them. And for those of you watching online or here at the club, you enjoy our programs, please do support us by becoming members. And you can also actually make suggestions if you are interested in what kind of program you'd like to see and hear from us. So on that note, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and just want to make a quick announcement on future events going forward. The next one we have, we have a piano piano night this coming Friday, and next Tuesday, when we have
Wednesday, I think, isn't it?
Next 24th. Wednesday, sorry.
November 24th.
November 24th. We have a panel on Thailand's economy, 2 steps forwards, how many steps backwards. That would be an interesting one. And of course, on Thursday, we have a panel I'm hosting on Thailand after the Constitutional Court verdict. There will be a discussion about Article 112 and that sort of thing. We are joined by former Prime Minister Apisit Vejashiwa as well. So that will be interesting. So tune in. So on that note, thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy.
Can I just add one thing? Yeah, I just also wanted to thank our co-sponsors tonight, Nizian based in New York, which has become a sponsoring partner for us. So please keep an eye on our schedule.
Okay. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Richard.